spider came, spins a web any size, catches thieves just like flies. Look out, here comes the Spider-Man. Is he strong? Listen, bud, he's got radioactive blood.
Hey folks, it's Jim from The Rewind, here to review the enjoyable, if not slightly underwhelming, The Amazing Spider-Man. If you're well versed in the Spider-Man origin, or if not, here's the lowdown on the staples of Spider-Man, at least when it comes to the web crawler on the big screen. Number 1, Peter Parker, nice nerd, lives with his uncle and Aunt May after the disappearance of his parents. Number 2, he tends to pine for some girl, whether it be Mary Jane or in this case Gwen Stacy, who is his first love interest in the comics. Number 3, he gets bitten by a radioactive spider and gains superpowers. Number 4, his Uncle Ben is murdered by a criminal that Peter could have stopped, making him learn to be responsible with his powers. And number 5, lastly, Peter becomes Spider-Man, beating the bad guys, and this time around it's the scientist Dr. Curt Connors who tries to create a regeneration serum to help regrow limbs, but it goes terribly wrong and he becomes the Lizard with questionable motivations. He has a lot of qualities that recall the Green Goblin of the first film. I guess Sony applied the logic, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So it's been 5 years since Spider-Man 3 and 10 years since the original Spider-Man film by Sam Raimi. I have strangely been optimistic about this reboot when I first heard about it. It's one of the more popular comic book characters, so it would make sense it would return to the big screen sooner than later. Given the trailer too, I thought there may be enough differences, but the trailer is somewhat misleading as well. The film lacks the freshness of the original, hitting familiar but arguably necessary beats while still putting its own slightly different spin on them. If anything, it should be an interesting companion piece with that of the first, and who knows, perhaps if this came out first, many more people would have preferred this take on the webhead. I can't blame anyone for disliking the film, feeling it falls under the been there, done that quality, but while it lacks the novelty of the first, and of course it comes nowhere near Spider-Man 2, it's still significantly better than Spider-Man 3. Anyway, on to the good. Number 1, Andrew Garfield. People have their own interpretation of what Peter Parker should be, but I was glad to see Garfield give a rather different performance than Maguire while staying true to the character. As director Mark Webb said, the film bears a strong resemblance to Ultimate Spider-Man than, say, Steve Ditko's take in the 1960s, which played a large inspiration in the Sam Raimi films. Number 2, Emma Stone. Stone just has a certain spark. She has a tendency to play or interpret characters in a different way than most actresses her age. As Gwen Stacy, or resourceful chief intern at Oscorp, it's nice to see an actress not merely playing the damsel in distress. If I recall, there's only one part where her life is threatened, and no one uses her as a hostage this time around. You know how many times Mary Jane was in physical danger in the first Spider-Man film? 3.
Well, beats taking the subway.
She even helps Spider-Man out. Her relationship with Peter is a bit rushed, unfortunately, which is a shame since the film is the most dynamic when those two are on screen together. Perhaps this is why Webb, who directed 500 Days of Summer, was chosen for such a project. Number 3, this is arguable, but the action. Rhys Ifans makes a strong impression with what he has, but the more the film progresses, the less interesting it gets. As opposed to Norman Osborn of the first, he lacks those complexities after the serum takes effect. I'm also not entirely sure I love the design of the Lizard or its heavy use of CGI, but there were some interesting action beats due to the character. Lizard makes an initial attack on a school which goes from rather poor to rather exciting. This was the longest brawl in the flick, and it's the one where it's the most creative. Webb might be no Raimi, but even I have to admit he came up with some pretty clever Spidey action techniques that were not present in the other films. The way he would web across the floor or web all around the Lizard was rather inventive. It kind of felt like a comic book or a cartoon. Number 4, briefly I will say Martin Sheen was rather solid as Uncle Ben, and the always good Dennis Leary provides some nice humor as Captain George Stacy, Gwen's father who issues an arrest for Spider-Man. There's no BS with Leary. He doesn't try to play up a scene too much for emotion. I like that. Now on to the not so good stuff. Number 1, the film introduces the mystery of Peter Parker's parents. It's interesting, but they just drop it. There's no satisfying conclusion or answer to it all. Perhaps it will be addressed in the sequel, but I'd rather get a wholly satisfying story. Number 2, Connors just is too familiar to that of Norman Osborn. If there's one thing most of these superhero films drop the ball on, it's the villains, and they come off as stock characters. There's plenty of individual scenes with him, but they just aren't as interesting. Number 3, Uncle Ben's death. They didn't nail it this time like they did in the first film, and its impact feels diluted. Also, they dropped the whole Peter finding Uncle Ben's killer plotline as well. Number 4, the pacing is a bit off, and the film could have been a bit tighter as well. Overall, though, I did mildly enjoy The Amazing Spider-Man. It does what it sets out to do and not much else. In the summer, you can't ask for a whole lot more. It shows a lot of promise for future sequels, and I think Garfield really carries this first installment. Oh, and as a side note, I have to admire Sony's approach to this film. Yes, it's slightly less colorful than the Raimi films, but I never felt that they were trying to make the film darker or too dark or more realistic because that's what's in right now. So many producers make that mistake. The film is pretty absurd and not necessarily grounded, and that's perfectly fine. Parker does have a heavy life, but there's plenty of joy and humor to his life as well. I can only hope that Warner Brothers isn't releasing a dark Superman next summer. So all in all, was it too soon for a reboot? Maybe, but it's no sooner than a Green Lantern reboot. I still have to recover from the first one to even consider seeing a reboot of that. That's it for the Movie Rewind. Have a good day, folks. Until next time.
In the chill of night, at the scene of a crime, like a streak of light, he arrives just in time. Spider-Man, Spider-Man, friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Welcome fame, he's ignored. Action is his reward to him. Life is a great big bang. Wherever there's a hang, you'll find a Spider-Man.